Thank you, and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the kind and generous introduction. So what I'd like to talk about today is the so-called digital tools against COVID-19. You already heard a lot about various of those tools, but specifically zooming into the ethical challenges in relation to public trust and acceptance. And I will control my slides here. Let me see how that works. Well, okay, there we are. Okay, so I'd like to start by bringing in my perspective so all of you know where I am coming from. I'm a professor of bioethics, I work on health policy, and so I take the health angle in my analysis. I've also, a lot of what I'm going to say today and the way my views were formed over the last 18 months are influenced by the fact that I was a member of the Swiss COVID-19 Science Task Force, specifically in the area of digital epidemiology, and I chaired the WHO expert group on the ethics of digital proximity tracing, and also co-chaired the expert group on the ethics and governance of AI in health. Our report was launched just a few hours ago today. Now, in doing this, my perspective is also formed by, let's say, two different traditions. One is public health ethics, one is digital ethics. And again, as a way of giving you the background of how I think about those issues, I'd like to point out some similarities and difference between those two ways of thinking about challenges. Public health ethics, as many of you I'm sure know, is an area of thought that has a longer history. We've been having to deal with public health and its challenges for much longer. We also, over the years, have developed several frameworks. And the aim of those frameworks was to assist public health practitioners and public health as a discipline to foster population health while protecting individual rights. The community and the values that help us be a community were at stake and are at stake when we're thinking about public health ethics. And for a long time, public health was mainly trying to address states, to guide states in order to develop public health practices and public health policies that are aiming to not only protect the common good of health, but also to protect those individual rights. The reason for that is typically states are those responsible for developing public health activities, strategies, and deploying tools. So that's one way of thinking, several frameworks and a longer history that at least informs my thinking. The other area that is also very relevant when we're thinking about digital tools in public health is digital ethics. Now, digital ethics is a newer field, a younger field, also because the whole development of the digital is slightly younger than public health itself. There have been some frameworks around already, but not as many as in public health ethics. And the aim of most of those frameworks are to foster innovation while protecting also individual rights. The main idea is how to help everyone, and mainly the stakeholders involved, to commit to responsible innovation, and very often address both the private sector and the states. Let's not forget that a lot of thinking about digital ethics stemmed from the fact that the private sector, in their developing the collection of data and uses of data, created some challenges that digital ethics came to address. So these are the different, let's say, but quite complementary when you're thinking about digital tools in public health, frameworks and ways of addressing these questions. Now, when thinking about those, there is those two ways of thinking about the ethical challenges in digital health tools have overlapping moral space. And there, in that overlapping space, we identified or we have identified principles that can help us identify the challenges and articulate them more clearly, but also help us to address them. Here are some of those principles, and I will weave those through my talk in the next minutes. The principle of autonomy, of beneficence, of privacy, solidarity, fairness and equity, and legitimacy. I'm listing them here, but I'm coming to them in some more detail. Now, what happened during the pandemic? During the pandemic, as of course you've heard already today, and you all know because we all experienced this together, it's not a description of something that happened at some point. we're still in that. There was a proliferation of what many had called digital tools. A kind of an urge to move very quickly from analog tools, tools that public health had used before, to their digital version. And here on this slide, you can see some of in some work that we did fairly early in the pandemic last year, trying to look at different types of digital tools that were put forward for public health purposes, and at the same time thinking through who are those who are issuing the tools, what types of data they're using, how they're implementing them in terms of voluntariness or not. And the reason we're asking these questions, we're trying again, driven by those principles that I mentioned earlier, we wanted to start articulating the specific challenges that we're faced with. Now, perhaps one of the most well-known examples of these digital tools that we all had a little bit to do with was the example of digital proximity tracking or the digital contact tracing. Again, taking a public health tool that we know from the analog world and trying to give it to its digital version and its digital flavor. Digital proximity tracing or digital contact tracing gained a lot of popularity. We had, of course, here in Switzerland, but also in many countries. This is just some work we recently did, looking at the European landscape of those apps, and again asking some of the questions of where they were developed, who issued them, on what basis, with or with a legal framework in it, etc. What that shows is that fairly quickly, I mean, in the big scheme of things, at least by June 2020, we had a number of those tools in the contact tracing space available in many European countries, but of course also in many Asian countries, and in a more patchwork kind of approach in the United States. Again, this is another slide of a recent paper that put together what happened in the various countries and in the United States, and you can see what's interesting here, and please remember that for some points I'm going to come to later, is the uptake that those apps seem to have, which with some exceptions seem to be on the lower end of the spectrum rather on the higher end of the spectrum. There's a lot to talk about as it relates to the why, and I'll come to this later, but that's just very quickly sort of marking some of the important developments in the digital tools in public health during the pandemic. Another, again, tool that is gaining popularity, at least as long as talking about it and developing frameworks around it, is the digital certification for either vaccines or recovery or tests that is going to be launched also in Europe as of July 1st, and some countries have already deployed those kinds of systems. But in between the contact tracing apps and the digital certification tools that perhaps have the most attention or had the most attention, so much else would happen in all kinds of different ways. The digital was not just one single tool here and there, it was pretty much everywhere. And in that respect, digital technology was the tool, not just a digital tool. I think this paper by Woodlaw et al. Last year tried to precisely give that notion that digital technology in its many formulations and products, it's actually the tool through which we're trying to address that pandemic. And at that point, that at least that paper, and note the date, it was published earlier last year in 2020, seemed to assert that it is the digital technology is a tool that in fact helped some countries to do better in the pandemic. One could think that some countries maybe that was too much of an early assessment, and again we'll see later why I think that might have been an early assessment. But what we need to remember, I think, from the very, very quick description of what really happened during the pandemic is that digital technology was the tool, with having its different formations and formulations in wherever it was needed. Now, on the basis of that very quick overview, and I know many of you here in the audience have seen some version of this digital tool, I'd like to just bring up some observations that I think are quite important for what we mean when we talk about the ethics of the ethical challenges, in particular of those kinds of technologies, and perhaps how to take lessons, use lessons from these observations in order to kind of formulate better frameworks and a more comprehensive approach in the future. So let me start with the first one, that many people who were thinking about the technologies while they're also fighting this pandemic was this notion of solutionism, how a digital technology in general, but also in its versions of specific tools, was presented as the solution to the very complex problem of the pandemic. One of the early papers about the digital contact tracing, for example, seemed to use language that implied and brought out the message that this is something that will solve this big problem. And the wording here, I've highlighted some of the wording. I hope you can see the slide clearly. Words like this would be sufficient to stop the epidemic. Okay, if it's used together with other tools, but we never saw the reverse, for example, that in particular certain measures will be sufficient. It seemed that technology was getting the was on the stage as the primary mover. What was interesting in this so-called solutionism approach is that, of course, nobody detracted from the ethical challenges that it raises. And very often we'll see, not only in talks, but also in the general discourse and also in publications, a list of things that sound ethical and need to be taken care of. But, you know, it was unclear how we're going to take care of them. I think that slide captures for me very much the spirit of especially the earlier times in this pandemic in relation to the particular tool of digital contact tracing. You see here Thierry Breton from the European Union. He's sort of representing the state and the government, the private sector represented by Tim Cook and his attempt to help in developing those technologies. And then this beautiful checklist here, the list of things that have been ticked off, all ethical concerns, anonymization, voluntariness, transparency, security, and then, of course, calling those tools the confinement apps, the things that will get us out of this problem. That's in the early days of the pandemic, where most of us were in some form or other of lockdown. And so the presentation of having a solution, like one thing that will do it for us, with and if, of course, we check the issues, a list of things that we need to look at. Now, at the same time, we're doing some work on those issues of ethics, and it seemed that we had a much more complex picture than just a list of things we'll tick off. The principles that I started us off with if you think about them in the context of these technologies, they give rise to many very concrete, specific challenges around how we're going to do, for example, anything around consent, about the expiration of these technologies, about how we can or not repurpose them, a very longer list of very specific issues that are derived from or are dictated almost from these technologies. And then, at least in our attempt, we tried to offer some ways in which throughout the technology cycle, but also from its development or its deployment, implementation, and follow-up, these need to be thought carefully and being monitored closely. So it was far away from just ticking off some list that could help us solve the problem. Now, another area that I think it's another observation or a cluster of observations, I think comes from scholarship that I do find quite intriguing and very helpful. Colleagues like Lynette Taylor and Michael Veal and others have spoken a lot about what they call technology theater. It's related to this idea of solutionism, but I think it gets a very specific interpretation here. In particular, these colleagues are writing about not the contact tracing apps, I think they've done some work on that as well, but more specifically about the vaccination certificates or the immunity certificates. And they present this concept of how this rhetoric performance is combined with technical performativity to, as they argue, justify certain mechanisms of discrimination, inequality, and exclusion. So I'm quoting directly from their blog. They have a paper coming up very soon. What they're arguing is that there is this whole notion of verification theater, immunity theater, border theater, equality theater, things that sound like technology can resolve, but things that actually are so complex and embedded in society in ways that no technology can quickly fix. So this quick fix approach with this sort of theatrical performance of what technology can do to us is one observation that I think is quite important and necessary, because it distracts from what actually technology can do, but also from where the ethical challenges are. With that, I want to kind of, before I move to my other observation, this is sort of an observation, but more of a background. I wanted also, one of the things that I've been thinking on during the pandemic is this has been a pandemic of binaries. What we kept hearing in a lot of the discourse everywhere, from the lay media to actually more advanced academic scholarship, was this notion of one or the other. So for example, it was the privacy versus health, or health versus economy, or freedom versus health, or we who are something versus the others who are something else. And again, for state or versus non-state actors. And I think this form of the framing of the many challenges we had in this formulation of binaries was actually counterproductive. It used language of trade-offs, it discounted certain values, it led to polarization because you either had to be with one camp or the other camp. It led to more unimaginative proposals. And generally, I think it has been counterproductive in policymaking and in sustaining the social license that public policy around in times of pandemics is very important. And I use that background of binaries to move on to my next observation, because I think one that encapsulated actually the binaries more than perhaps several others was this notion of privacy versus health. And this was particularly important in the context of digital technology. So the idea was that you really have to give up privacy in order to gain the benefit of health, either as an individual or health is in the sense of a common good that the community shares. This was quite prevalent early on when the discussion about the potential of public health surveillance is enhanced through digital means, but also very much within the context of contact tracing and proximity tracing apps. In some way, I had the impression, and I have the impression, that privacy, although a very important consideration, it almost monopolized the debate around the issues, the ethical challenges that digital technologies are raising. And in some ways also it captured all ethical considerations, which I think, and as I will say a little later, I think it did not do justice to all and many ethical challenges that are raised when the digital becomes the means through which we try to achieve certain goods. I also think that the concern about privacy, it was instrumentalized by different actors in a very kind of intelligent way, because privacy is a main consideration, and I by no means want to detract of its value, but it was not the single consideration, and it is not the singular ethical challenge that we are facing. So the debate about privacy, the framing that it had, was also interestingly infused by geopolitical kinds of intuitions that we have. For example, how privacy is treated in Asian countries, how we treat privacy, or we approach privacy in the European context or in the American context. For example, this is one tweet that came out of Taiwan at some point, and it was widely shared everywhere as an example of what we don't want to do, for example, in certain settings, seeing very intrusive about how technology is used to gain a health benefit at the very severe cost of privacy. In Europe, we had more of an intense discussion around the centralized versus decentralized digital tracing, the conflict between how national health authorities want to establish those systems the way they want to control it. And again, here we saw that the narrative of binaries as to we, the state, versus them, the other actors, are going to be what was played out in this respect. This debate about privacy was quite active in not only in the broader discourse of ethics, but also in the legal and regulatory space. And we had very quickly opinions from the European Data Protection Supervisor by ICOs around the world in relation to what can happen. And most of them would say that certain technologies of privacy preserving nature have to be used, but in a state of emergency, privacy could questions about privacy will be treated differently, essentially, than compared to normal times. And that is a reason, again, that I think privacy seemed to capture all the ethical concerns and without allowing the full spectrum of ethical issues to be adequately examined. To the extent that I think this has also, and in that sense, I want that to be more of a learning than an observation. It seems that when we look back already in the 1 year of those technologies and uses, we may also see a difference in how people have treated privacy as liability. For example, I was quite surprised by this article. It was published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, and arguing that Europe, which seemed to be the continent with the countries in Europe that they were more keen on preserving privacy, that they might have learned something. If you see the quote here, having learned from this experience, Europeans may be much more amenable to sharing location data for contact tracing in health emergencies. It should help in combating the next pandemic, that the balance between preserving privacy and preserving life has changed during this pandemic. First of all, I'm not sure that has happened. But second, it seems again that we are charging privacy with perhaps our failure to combat this pandemic more efficiently and sooner. And that is, again, a worry. It's a worry that we had privacy becoming the main and one and only ethical issue with the digital in public health. And now we're having privacy being the villain for why certain things failed. And part of this problem is that we're reducing complexity into one thing, whether it's privacy or something else, but it is not one thing. This is much more complex than one thing being responsible for what happened. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to change the slide here. Now, related to that is the question of evidence. And here are a number of other observations that I think really important. This comes from the work we also did at WHO. We provided a list of ethical considerations to guide the use of digital proximity tracing that was issued back in 2020 as interim report, but it hasn't changed since then. One question at that time was that since those technologies, those products of digital technology are new, we need to have them tested and provide evidence that they can be efficacious and effective. Now, that is quite an essential and crucial element in the discussion of success or failure and ethical viability of some of these technologies. Does digital contact tracing work? The question is, how does work is defined? Is it just the technology itself, in terms of itself and what it can do alone on its own, or it relates and depends on how it's integrated within the public health response, whether it's updated or not, whether there's coordination with other parts of the public health response, and whether it's promoted or not. And I'm glad to see that these thinking of what does it mean that a technology work, and what does it mean to seek evidence for the technology that works or not, it is hard to disentangle from how it's placed within the broader response. So saying that something worked or privacy, for example, was responsible or not responsible for a success or a failure, I think it's quite weak unless we understand the technology within its setting. And I'm raising this issue because it is also necessary to look at that's happened with the contact tracing, but now we're going to face something similar with the COVID status certification. This is a very recent report from the House of Commons, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, that again is calling for criteria against which the efficacy of that system is to be assessed. So we need to look at the efficacy of the system. But what we need to be reminded is that the efficacy of the system is not just the technical part of the system. That I'm hoping it's going to be one of the important learnings. The other next set of observations have to do with the players in this space. And here come ethical questions that I don't think are captured, for example, from a singular focus on privacy. So private actors and big tech, years ago, we did some work with colleagues at WHO and the Boston Children's Hospital, looking at how does the ecosystem of health data works. And at that time, we identified the change, not only the expanding data ecosystem, including what kind of resources, how we can analyze them, but also who are the players. And clearly, the private sector, the big tech, was a main player. And again, we saw that happening very much in the pandemic. The big tech played a critical role in public health. It became an actor in the development of public health infrastructure, especially if you look at contact tracing apps. It became an actor in standard setting. There was clearly some asymmetry of power, and there are issues around the legitimacy of these actors in playing a role in public health infrastructures. Some quotes here just to remind us that these actors have been extremely active, but they do not necessarily carry the same legitimacy that states carry and public health authorities carry when they develop and deploy public health tools. Public health, the public also was and has been concerned about the role of those actors. In some work that we and others did, we saw that represented in the media and elsewhere. And so this is a major issue that needs to be addressed for the future. What is the role of big tech, and particularly another relevant private sector when we're talking and developing public health infrastructure, such as digital infrastructure, digital health tools. And finally, one other set of considerations that are critical here is this notion of governance. What we realized is that, and that's a quote from OECD, that few countries have frameworks in place to support the extraordinary contact tracing and population-wide surveillance measures that are envisaged. That came very early on in the pandemic, before even the tracing apps were deployed. What we learned is that the guidelines, because we had many guidelines about governance, that they have been effective or they haven't been adequate, especially to be used for the time we needed them. There was quite a lot of distance from the theory to practice. There was deficit in public engagement in order to enact this governance, and there were regulatory issues that had been unresolved and could not be resolved at the time of an emergency. Interestingly enough, the Global Health Security Index in 2019 identified actually as an area of deficit in most countries the fact that the real-time surveillance and reporting systems are not adequate. That I'm linking that part, that indicator of that report, to the fact that governance was missing. And so we cannot have these digital tools developed and deployed successfully without appropriate governance in place. Similarly, we identified that as a concern in the ethical guidance that we issued from WHO, specifically referring also to independent oversight as part of the governance mechanism. Independent oversight we did not see happening in most of the contact tracing systems that have been deployed. And something similar surely applies to digital certification processes. And again, it will be interesting to see if they might be developed. For systems like this, at least myself and colleagues have developed the concept of adaptive governance for digital public health tools, a system in which there's continuous monitoring, continuous reflective and reflexive engagement with the legal, ethical, and technological issues and with the public in order to adapt quickly and be able to see whether those technologies will have, where their weaknesses are, where are their benefits, so they can keep adapting and being done the right way. So in conclusion, I wanted to come back to the principles I started us off with: autonomy, beneficence, privacy, solidarity, fairness and equity, and legitimacy as the key principles that should help us navigate the use of and the ethical challenges of the use of digital tools against COVID-19. The first, and derived from those, I think my concluding remarks are that those tools for COVID-19, but also for future pandemics, are part of the public health infrastructure. I think we'll be naive to think that we're not going to have them again. But we need to articulate the governance of digital public health tools. We have not done that yet. We need to address the deeper societal issues of inequity, because these were the things that cut across all the developments we had so far. We need to negotiate transparently with big tech, because they are going to play a role. And we need to commit to public engagement, perhaps not only at the time that we have an emergency, but before, in order to make sure that when the emergency comes, when the particular circumstances are there, we have the right mechanisms and the right knowledge for the development of those tools in a way that promote social good. And I'll stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Effy, for the very, very interesting talk. So let me start with a very provocative question about in the last year and a half we learned a lot. I mean, even for people who are not coming from an ethical background, we start reading a lot and paying more attention. And you provide us the example of the very nice paper by Ferretti et al. In Science. That it's an amazing paper from a modeling perspective, but indeed I recognize now that it has been used both to promote and against the idea of the contact tracing app. So my question is, do you think that in the last year and a half we learned something and we start acting differently, maybe both as a researcher communities or I don't know, like for journalists or politicians? So we improved or not?
Well, I hope we did. I certainly think that we learned a lot. We were much more exposed, whether it's lay people or scientists or journalists or anybody. I think we're much more exposed with those kinds of challenges that some in the academic circles were dealing with in theory, but not in practice, and not in the context of a real life-threatening emergency, right? So I think there was much more exposure and much more engagement, which I think is a good thing. But that's why I also called my point observations, because typically what happens, we make observations, but we need to know if these observations are real lessons. I think if we revert back to, okay, let's tick the box, we need to have autonomy, we need to have privacy, we need to have transparency, but we'll think about it later. I don't think we learned. And that's why I'm a little reluctant to say we learned. What we certainly did is we got exposed very much, all of us, in the difficulties, in the actual challenges, in the difficulty in how difficult it is to address them adequately. And my hope is that we'll learn, but I'd like to see evidence of that learning before I say that we did learn. We're certainly very exposed to all of these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. So at least you are perceiving that ethics is more considered well beyond just the research circles, and this is something that feels very reassuring. So
for sure, and I think you could see that also in it's been very interesting to see how much more popular these questions became. Even if people don't have a good answer to those questions, how should we do this or that? I think they became much more popular, and that's a very good start, I think.